David Schoeni. You may know me as the pastor's wife, husband. I've been asked to cover approximately 50 years of disagreements about homosexuality in the United Methodist Church in the next 10 minutes. I have enough material for a semester course, so we'll see what we get through. I'm a historian at heart, so instead of going back 50 years, I'm going to go back to the 1700s, because you can't really know where we are without knowing where we've come from. The Methodist movement that sparked all of this started within the Church of England by two brothers, John and Charles Wesley. They eventually were both priests in the Anglican Church. If you get bored sometime in church, don't tell my wife I said this, but you can look through the hymnal. You'll find a lot of Charles Wesley hymns. He wrote hundreds and hundreds of hymns. And if you're ever really having an insomniac night, you can read a John Wesley sermon. It'll put you out, I promise. They're very dull. But those are our founders. And they got worried that the church of their day was turning away people who needed to know about Christ, because they were so concerned about how you dress, how the music is, how the worship is, the big buildings, everything that's the grand trappings of the Church of England. And so they started up this renewal movement called the Methodist Society, and it first started with the Holy Club at Oxford in 1729. It was a group of students that got together to study the Bible, to pray together, and to hold each other accountable on their faith journeys. Now in America, the Methodist Church, let's not go there yet. Methodists were among all the colonists. So prior to the United States of America even existing, there were Methodists here. Colonists that came over brought their Methodist meetings with them. They got together for Bible study, for prayer, for holding one another accountable. And one of the things that happened was, and they continued to follow the pattern that the Wesleys had set for them, which is, you do all those things as society meetings, but you still go to the church. In this case, it was the Church of England, still in this country, for your sacraments. Well, we all know what happens in 1776. The Revolution comes along, American Revolution. Suddenly, all the Church of England priests are either leave voluntarily or involuntarily from this country, and there's no longer access for Methodists to get the sacraments, which John Wesley is a very big believer in the sacraments. And so with his blessing, we formed the Methodist Church in this country. Methodist Episcopal Church was founded in 1784 at the Christmas Conference, December of 1784. And to give you sort of the framework, I mean, we know 1776, we always think of that as the beginning, but the U.S. Constitution is being ratified in 1788, 1789. So all that the founding of the Methodist Church is really the founding of the constitutional democracy of the United States. Those are happening at the same time in history. And so, as you would expect, the United Methodist Church mirrors the United States constitutional government. In the United Methodist Church, we have three branches: an executive branch, which is made up of the Council of Bishops. We don't have a single president, but it's the whole council makes up the executive branch. There's a judicial council, which is the judicial branch. And then we have a legislative branch, the General Conference. Now, the General Conference meets every 4 years. It's always been fascinating to me. It meets during the same, it's every 4 years, and it's the same year that we elect presidents. So you can imagine that presidential politics always finds its way into General Conference, because that's what we're doing in our country at the same time. The General Conference is the only body that can speak officially for the United Methodist Church. Laura can't stand up and say the United Methodist Church says so-and-so. Our bishop cannot stand up and do that. Our church cannot do that. Only the General Conference can officially make a statement that the United Methodist Church believes X, Y, or Z. In terms of who can petition the General Conference, anyone can. Any member, any ordained minister, a Sunday school class, church council, any official body of the United Methodist Church can send a petition to the General Conference. The General Conference is charged with many things, but the primary thing is to revise the church law book, which is called the Book of Discipline. This is left over from John Wesley's days. He was very clear that what it meant to be Methodist, even our name. It was originally a derogatory term that they called the Holy Club. They called them, oh, you're Methodists. You follow such a method. You're so boring. But be glad, we could have been called the Bible Moths, because that was another nickname they gave them, because they spent time studying by their candles to study the Bible. But the United Bible Moth Church, that gets a little complicated. Anyway, so the General Conference is the body that revises the Book of Discipline. It has about 850 delegates, equal number clergy and lay, and it's made up of delegates elected by the U.S. annual conferences as well as the international conferences. So that's just to give you the background of who we are and how we got to where we are. So how did we get to the current place in this controversy? That again is a very long and detailed story. I'm going to try to hit just a few of the highlights so that we, most of this is in the handout, the purple handout that you have in front of you. I tried to outline it. As Mary Margaret said, can you do the whole history in 10 minutes? And then, oh yeah, can you reduce it to 2 half pages? So it really pushed my editorial skills. 1968, the Methodist Church, which many of you may have grown up in, the Methodist Church, joined with the Evangelical United Brethren Church, and we became the United Methodist Church. Many people think united is an adjective, that we are supposedly united, but it's actually a part of a name of another denomination that we came together in 1968. In the part of the country that I'm from, in the Midwest, you always say the United Methodist because there are lots of Evangelical United Brethren heritage people in that part of the country, and they feel very left out when you just call it the Methodist Church. I go to the Methodist Church. No, you go to the United Methodist Church. It's 2 churches that became one. This was the highlight and the high point in terms of the numbers of United Methodists when this union happened in 1968. Now, meanwhile, in the world at large, 1969, the Stonewall riots happened in New York City. A gay nightclub was raided by police. The patrons resisted being arrested for being in a private club by themselves, not bothering anyone. And this is usually listed as the beginning of the gay rights movement. So 68, we become this united church. 69, Stonewall riots. 1973, the American Psychiatric Association removes mental illness from the diagnostic DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's what psychiatrists use to diagnose mental illness. But it was, homosexuality designation was removed from that document in 1973. So this is sort of what's going on out in the world at large. In 1972, to go back 1 year, the first General Conference of the new church. So this is bringing in EUB and Methodists coming together for their first General Conference. And this is the first time that we have a document called the Social Principles. These are statements in the Book of Discipline that reflected primarily an American and mostly white male point of view. At that point, the vast majority of delegates to the General Conference were white males and were American. And so these are statements that says the United Methodist Church believes this about this topic. And there are things about sexuality, but there are also things about the environment, about gambling, about relationships, about violence, about many of the things you wouldn't believe the depth and the breadth of these things. But they are stated as positions on these very issues, but they have never been considered church law. So they are not things that, for example, there is a paragraph about gambling and the lottery. There is no precedent. They're not considered church law. So we're not saying that if any church member plays the lottery, they're out. That's not what the social principle says. Social principle says the General Conference of the United Methodist Church has made this statement about gambling and the lottery. Can you hear that difference between you cannot do it and this is a statement that our church has made? Okay. So we have these social principles, and they're brought to the General Conference. They go through the committee process, which is a fascinating and amazing process that happens at this with 850 people divided into subcommittees and subcommittees and sub-subcommittees and sub-sub-subcommittees. And they deal with because every piece of legislation gets looked at. So if a 12-year-old in a church in rural Kansas writes a petition about serving a certain kind of grape juice in church, somebody at General Conference will look at that. Some subcommittee will take a look at that and decide whether to recommend it to be passed or not, and it'll be voted on. Sometimes they get voted on in great big bunches, but they all get looked at. So the social principles had gone through that whole process, came to the floor of the General Conference, and someone stood up and amended them and added a phrase to the social principles that homosexuality was incompatible with Christian teaching. With no study, very little discussion, this phrase got put into the social principles in 1972. The United Methodist Church Constitution, which has the founding document of Methodists worldwide, doesn't have anything about homosexuality in it. It deals with discipleship, it deals with race and gender and a whole lot of things, but it never has had anything that says about homosexuality in it. Since 1972, every General Conference has had a contentious debate over the restrictions that the church has placed on homosexual persons. About can a gay person be ordained? Can there be marriage between gay people? What about civil rights? What about AIDS? What about membership in the church? What about lay leadership? What about holding a chair position in the church? All those things have been discussed and argued about and controversial over the last 47 years. In 1988, there was a study commission on human sexuality appointed. This was a group of scholars and leaders from a variety of disciplines, including special interest groups. So there were sort of everybody who had a vested interest had somebody on the committee. And they met together and studied and heard from experts and looked at scripture, tradition, reason, experience, that's the Wesleyan Quadrilateral, to examine the complexity of modern understandings of sexuality. Which now they're saying, in 1992 or 1988, the modern understandings of sexuality. A lot of things have changed even since then. But this report and legislation came back the next General Conference, so 1992, and they made recommendations about changes to language in the Book of Discipline based on that committee's findings, which included people from all different aspects of the church. The General Conference refused to take any action on the recommendations. They tabled the whole thing and decided to make the report available for study. That was what the 1992, I was actually at the 1992 General Conference, and it was sort of an amazing thing to watch, because everybody was loaded for bear to have this big argument, and somebody just said, let's just table it. And everybody was like, oh, okay. That'll be a lot easier. Let's just table it. Oh, no, but we'll study it because we're United Methodists. Let's study it. So that's all that happened with this incredible report. I mean, it's, and ironically, it's out of print now. I looked it up. It's no longer in print. But at the same time, the Presbyterians released this, did exactly the same thing. They did this in-depth study that they published that's phenomenal. You may still be able to get that one. I don't know about that one. And at General Conference in 2012, 2016, and then again at the special call General Conference in 2019, a growing majority of U.S. delegates approved a generous middle position that would replace this incompatible with Christian teaching language with a statement describing our current reality. Here's the statement that we voted on each of the last 3 General Conferences. We are not of one mind. There are faithful United Methodists on all sides. We choose to stay united in mission and ministry without agreeing about homosexuality. And that statement, when I say a growing majority of U.S. delegates, each year the U.S. delegates have more and more have voted for that statement. But each year there have been more and more international delegates, and so that statement keeps getting voted down about 51% to 49%. So we keep saying a statement that we disagree, we can't agree that we disagree. We disagree that we disagree, which is just mind-boggling. But that's where we are right now. Possible causes for this impasse. One, the United Methodist Church has a somewhat muddled commitment to being a global church. In the 19th and 20th centuries, we sent missionaries to plant Methodist churches all over the world, Eastern Europe, the Far East, Korea especially, the whole continent of Africa. Now, as the United Methodist population in the U.S. continues to decline, these planted churches are growing by leaps and bounds. In the 1990s, the numeric declines in the U.S. church, we started worrying that we were losing lots of members. So we decided to address that by accepting 5 million members from all the churches in Africa. So suddenly United Methodist Church has a lot of members again because all these churches in Africa were accepted as United Methodist churches. Got my pages all mixed. Sorry. This led to a substantial increase in international delegates. We said, Ivory Coast, there's millions of Methodists in Ivory Coast. And we said, join our church. And so General Conference has a rule. It can't have over 1,000 delegates. No matter how many United Methodists there are in the world, there can only be up to 1,000. So we have to refigure our percentages based on the number of members in each place. So as I'm from Midwest, a lot of the Midwest church conferences are shrinking. We only get 3 or 4 delegates to General Conference. Ivory Coast comes along, they join with several million people, and they instantly have 50, 60, 70 delegates that are coming to General Conference. In General Conference 2020, there will be 850 delegates. It will be split 56% US, 44% international. For comparison, in 1960, at the General Conference in 1960, it was 99% US delegates, 1% international delegates. In 1992, the year that the study commission came back, 89% US delegates, 11% international. So you see how this number has been changing. And this leads us to a related polity issue. Polity is church governance, how it is we go about being church. The United Methodist Church has become an international denomination with delegates from many different nations that have the power of the vote in the legislative branch that governs church polity. This is unprecedented. No other denomination, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, all global denominations, but when it comes to the legislative body that makes rules for the denomination, people have voice but no vote in those denominations. International folks do. In ours, without much thought and without really understanding how it was going to work, and in the interest of maintaining our nice big number that we are a very big church, we sort of stumbled our way into this. We don't know how this is going to work, but sure, why don't you all be delegates, and we'll all have voice, and we'll all have vote, and we'll see what happens. We have a system where international delegates, many who are from non-democratic countries, vote and even serve on our judicial council in a system that's modeled after a U.S. democratic constitutional form of government, when that's not their experience, that's not their context, that's not their culture. And any more than I would know what to do if I was dropped in Angola, Africa, to interpret the culture and the government, and we're asking those folks to fit into a U.S. structured form of government, governing our church. So it means that General Conference has the power in this sort of backwards way to meddle in the practices of ministry and forms of authority and cultural realities of any nation that's a member. So, for example, in 2016 at General Conference, there was a constitutional amendment that was passed for ratification by the annual conferences about the equality of women, declaring that women and men are equal. 44 annual conferences outside the US voted as blocks. That means that either they were 100% for it or 100% against it. Now, typically when the constitutional amendment comes to the Holston Conference, they'll vote and it'll be 73% to 27%. And that's what you forward to the General Church. So basically you're saying that in these international, there's sort of the sense of winner takes all. Whatever we decide, we're 100% for it or we're 100% against it. And this block voting actually meant that worldwide, the constitutional amendment declaring the United Methodist Church believes in the equality of women failed by 0.2%. So here you see the dynamic at work that when we've created a system where we give, anyway, you see where I'm not sure I can explain it any other way. So with some exceptions, in terms of homosexuality, international delegates vote primarily as a bloc in terms of matters of homosexuality. Their culture, their traditions, they're in a different place and a different setting than we are in the U.S. All churches outside the U.S. have a great flexibility to translate and adapt the social principles to their own culture and to organize ministry through forms that fit their local needs and cultural understandings. But in a twist, we don't. The U.S. church doesn't have that same freedom. We put the rule, it's called paragraph 101 in the Book of Discipline. And we put it in place when the United States had an overwhelming majority of delegates, and we were trying not to be as colonial as we've been in the past. No, it's okay, you don't have to do it this way. We understand your culture is different from ours. Well, now it's flipped around, and it's no longer, we don't have a statement, but we need a statement that says our culture is different from yours, and so we need to have flexibility that way as well. And so ironically, we have international delegates who vote on a book of discipline, which they are not exclusively bound by. So you're talking about, we come up for a vote, you can vote the way you think is right, but you can go home and interpret the way that you need to for your cultural context. The third possibility of why this is happening is one that really doesn't need a lot of explanation. Our current culture and political context in this country is dominated by special interests, lobbying, the tactics and the funding that is polarizing. The same thing's been happening in the United Methodist Church since the early 80s. And like any large national nonprofit organization, we were used to operating with rules of open and honest dialogue. We weren't ready for this kind of mean-spirited, partisan, special interest, hardball tactics. Every election of a delegate or a bishop has become a binary ideological choice. You're either for us or against us. You either vote to toe the line or you don't. So we have this polarization that's been going on. And while there are undoubtedly special interest groups all over the theological spectrum, from liberal to conservative, the right wing has been the most instrumental in the homosexuality controversy. They've held rallies in Africa prior to General Conference, funded on-site pre-General Conference gatherings, served breakfasts and lunches and dinners to pass out voting guides, to say, we're glad you're here, vote this way, to the international delegates. And the funding primarily comes for these organizations, comes from foundations and individuals who are not United Methodists. They don't have any vested interest in the church. They don't go to a local United Methodist church. It's mostly foundations that are working across all the mainline denominations to try to get this sort of a divisive issue as the way that that's their strategy in terms of how they think. So it's not people like us who care about United Methodist churches and love our church and what we do and our ministry. It's money coming from outside that. Sorry, I can't gesture. This arm doesn't go up. I usually wave my arms a lot more when I'm talking. So, what's next? If I had a crystal ball. 2016, the General Conference asked the Council of Bishops to convene a task force. So this is, in 2016, our General Conference, called the Way Forward. After many months of meetings, the Way Forward presented 3 plans for how to proceed and called what turned out to be a very expensive General Conference for 2019. In 2019, we voted on a wide variety of legislation and passed the traditional plan by a margin of, you guessed it, 51% to 49%. It was actually even closer than that, so 54 votes difference. The traditional plan keeps all the current language in the Book of Discipline prohibiting homosexuals from being ordained or married in the United Methodist churches and punishes any clergy person performing a wedding, a homosexual wedding. Groups of faithful folks are meeting all over the country. There are gatherings like this in local churches. There are groups of churches getting together. There are conferences being held, strategizing and formulating plans for the legislation for General Conference 2020. I'd like to be able to stand here and tell you what's going to happen. But no one really knows for sure. And General Conference is notoriously unpredictable. Things come to General Conference, everybody thinks it's a great idea, and somebody will stand up on the floor and it'll go down in flames. Or it'll get tabled and studied. Probably most likely the second one. Let's table it and study it. We also don't know what's going to be constitutionally possible, because some of the proposals that are coming up are about splitting the church or dividing assets, or the term amicable divorce keeps coming up. And those, we don't know for sure what's going to be declared constitutional. If you're interested in reading about the many kinds of plans that are being formulated, on the back of your handout, there's a list of some of the main ones. The United Methodist News Service website has great summaries of everything. Insight is based in Texas. They got a grant it's basically a blog that anybody can get approved to put their insight onto what's going on in the United Methodist Church. There's also special interest groups all through the special interest groups all have their websites that you can look up, Google those and find them. But here's what I can tell you. I can't predict what's going to happen, but I can tell you we desperately want a simple solution. We've wanted a simple solution all along. We want somebody to stand up and say, this is the way, and everybody to say, oh, why didn't we think of that? That's what we thought was going to happen in 2019. We asked the bishops to lead us. They got together this incredible committee that had representatives from all walks of life in the United Methodist Church. They were going to show us the way forward. And they did. We crashed right into 51%, 49%. We are trapped in a winner-take-all mindset. We think, well, we just need to reverse it. Well, I'm here to tell you, even if we win, whoever we are, and what winning means, we're still going to be divided. 51% to 49%, doesn't matter which side of that you're on. We all lose when it's 51% to 49%. So I'm going to leave you with these two thoughts. Do we want to be a church that emphasizes church law and punishment? Or do we want to emphasize grace and equality for all who seek relationship with Christ? Another way to say that would be, are we faithful to our Wesleyan heritage? Or are we ready to be somebody else other than Methodists? And number two, whatever happens at General Conference 2020, this church, Broadway United Methodist Church, will continue on our journey to be a witness to the faith in Christ that we share here in downtown Maryville, Tennessee. The three simple rules from John Wesley: do no harm, do good, stay in love with God. Thank you.